ideas and ambitions and colorful pictures.
Ja, genau. Das sparen wir uns jetzt gerade. Also wir gehen, das siehst du ja auch in der Webseite, mit nichts raus. Auch wenn wir schon Content haben, weil wir nicht noch einer dieser vielen Decks sein wollen. Ja. Wir sammeln erstmal Content, wir schaffen ein Fundament und dann geht's los.
Gut.
So. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you, Thomas.
We met, the first time we met in person was almost 2 years ago in Estonia. And I think we migrated past each other in virtual stuff before and after. You're our latest guest today for the Pirate Academy learning space. We have no idea what we're learning, what to expect, but our goal is clear. We want to learn as much as possible about how to build independent, self-reliant communities. And you have a background in that is at least adjacent to that. And this is why you're here. And as usual, we are going to ask 2 questions, mainly. Who are you? And how would you build such a community? And let's dive right in with the first one. Who are you? What makes you you? What do you want to share for us to understand more about who you are?
Well, thanks for the invitation and for creating that space for that, Thomas. I really appreciate. And yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I think I'm not gonna try and answer it with any smart questions, but just like, more drop into my intuition and answer it from heart space and just see what comes up. So yeah, who I am, I think I'm still in the process of discovering that. I just turned 44, which I think is a beautiful number. And I just read this quote from, I think it's Sigmund Freud somewhere recently, where he said that you only start living as of 40 because everything else before is like a research or something like that. And somehow I feel in a very similar way, even though I believe I had a very diverse life so far. I've done a lot of things in my life already, but it just kind of feels like I'm only slowly starting to understand what life is about, who I am, to make sense of my life, of existence, of the world, of society. But at the same time, I feel it's hard to talk about it. I'm not a person who in a way talks a lot about things like that. It's more like an internal sense making, and probably describing myself more like as a introvert. It's more about, yeah, this personal sense making and not necessarily sharing that much of it, with an understanding that probably the meaning of life is something which we have to give ourselves. I don't think that we come into this world with a clearly defined purpose. I think there's a potentiality. There's a lot of things you could make out of this life, and obviously there's different, schools of thoughts about that, about whether incarnation or not, or whether there's like a higher force or a power, somebody that has a clear plan for you or not. And there might be a clear plan, but in the end, you still have to figure it out yourself. So that's what I've been doing the last 44 years. And so in a way, I would probably say that I've always been a seeker. I've always been searching for, you might call it the truth, or what feels true to me, what is my purpose. And it has not been an easy journey, because when I look back, I realized that I never really fitted into that system, and I was always at, I wouldn't say at war with the system, because this whole thing with being at war is a bit overused these days. So I was just constantly in friction with that system, because I didn't understand that system, because I didn't feel the system was humane. It wasn't allowing me to be who I was. And obviously, well, first of all, you're a child, you're, like, you're innocent, you're helpless, you go through education, you have to learn all these things which don't really make sense to you, and you kind of know they're useless in a way, but you still have to go through it. And then you start your career, and at some point you start questioning everything. You have your first, or I had my probably kind of first awakening moment, like about 10 years ago, when I was working in Asia back then. Like, things just didn't make any more sense, and I was just so unhappy and miserable somehow, even though I had this successful career and I was doing all this, things, let's say, kind of the outside was all fine. I had all the material things which you usually strive for, but I was just so miserable and unhappy, and obviously, getting into all the negative habits to kind of cover up with that, and until I really realized, well, there's something wrong, and I have to look for other answers or other approaches on how to find solutions. And that was a bit, when I started to discover, let's say, some aspects of spirituality or personal development, and started to realize that I'm much more than what I thought I am. And then it's kind of the famous rabbit hole thing, when once you start, and you can't really stop anymore. So this really sent me on a journey the last 10 years to really figure out what life's about. And obviously, a lot of the things that I had been doing until then, I couldn't do anymore, because I realized they're completely against my true self, or it just didn't feel well anymore. So the more and more I was kind of digging and discovering, I knew more clearly what I don't want anymore. Mm-hmm. But then what was missing was still the part, well, what do I really want? What is really, my calling in this life? And I think I got much deeper into that probably like 4.5, 5 years ago, when I really started to work with this question, well, what's my purpose? Who I am, what am I really supposed to bring into this world? And it was just, for me, it was, the whole journey was a struggle. I mean, of course, it had a lot of positive things about it. I mean, completely changed my life and had a lot of amazing experiences, met a lot of amazing people, and I just discovered a lot of amazing content and things. But it was hard, it was hard to work yourself out of that past conditioning, that idea of who you thought you are, and creating a new identity. I found that was a very intense, and it was a very intense process. Mm-hmm. And because I've always been somebody I'm not very good in compromising. So it's either, it's all in. And when I think back, I probably could have done that process a little bit more gentle with myself, or in a way where it's a bit, I don't know, where I wouldn't create that much suffering for myself. But, in the end, that's how it happened. And that's probably how I had to do it. So I think I could go back to maybe 4.5 years ago, when I went on a kind of 3-week vision quest to the mountains, where I really knew I had arrived at a point in my life where everything else I did before, I just cannot do it anymore, and I have to really figure out what it is. And so I went on this kind of vision quest with a lot of meditation, etc., and I started to somehow get very clear ideas, or you could call it visions, of what I was meant to do. And then once I had these answers, I knew kind of what I had to do or what I could do, but I still didn't really know how I'll have to do it, because that was still kind of like 4.5 years ago. And for me, the answer that really came was that, let's say, my purpose is really to support humanity's transition to a new paradigm. And I was like, wow, God, well, that sounds cool, but how the fuck I'm gonna do that, you know? And it kind of became a bit clear that with my background, which was in hotel management, that I'm quite good at kind of creating places or structures or, settlements in a way you could say. And so I thought the best way for me to really bring that purpose into life is to start creating places which in a way embody that new paradigm or that new world that I want to create. And that basically set me on a journey of, like 4.5 years of research into different, eco villages, community projects, retreat centers, ashrams, spaces, places. I visited many of those. I intended to create some of them on my own. I wrote a bunch of concepts and I had a few startups around that. And yeah, so I'm still in that space, and I really see that I feel that we are now as a, well, collective maybe is a bit of a big word, but I think there's a much bigger openness now for these topics. It really becomes a thing. I mean, there's like, hundreds of thousands of people on this planet who really see, fuck, I really want to live differently. I want to get out of this. And, how can we live? So I've seen now in these last, 4.5 years, a huge change in that market, which I'm very happy about, because finally all these things that I started to envision then are now kind of becoming slightly mainstream. But still, I mean, I cannot really live off that yet. What I really want to do, I'm still kind of trying to find my space and where I can, like put my qualifications in, like my USPs or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, so maybe to finish up with that question, I'm just a person who's like really, really passionate about life and about transformation, and I just believe that as a species or humanity, we're just in this very, very unique, decisive moment in human history where we can create a new society in a way. And that's why somehow I really see this as my calling, because I cannot go back to do anything else or just have like a random day job, or like you call it a bullshit job, but just like any kind of job which is not focusing on that, because I think it's so important and it's like so exciting to work on that yeah, I just can't do anything else. And yeah, I think that's who I am, and that's what I'm doing at the moment. And
Cool.
and that's what somehow brought me to Ibiza. I just, I recently moved to Ibiza on a very intuitive decision, because I just felt I have to be here. And I don't really know yet exactly why, but I just somehow trusted it. And then I'm here, and yeah, so that's who I am, I guess.
Cool. So thank you for the depth and the courage to be vulnerable in your description. I think it's it takes a lot of that, and it's important. So thank you for that, for setting the ground and letting me and whoever else might listen to this in to your life. Thank you. So on the basis of that, of what you said, the natural direction for the next question is our usual second question, which is based on all the things you've learned and seen and built and thought about. If you now had to, somewhere in the outback of the planet, you can choose where. It can be on an island, it can be in the forests of Norway, it can be in the rainforest, tropical rainforest, wherever you want it. you're there with 100 to 1,000 people, and you are building a self-sufficient, self-reliant community. Truly, you're not relying on tourists, you're not relying on government subsidies. You are surviving on your own terms, but maybe more than that, maybe even thriving on your own terms. That's the goal, right? And so with that picture in mind, and with your knowledge and intuitions about these kind of things, and without preparation, so we know we're surprising you with that question. So without preparation, what would you do? What do you think is important to do? What would your role be? How would you fill that role? What would you bring in from the current civilization design? What would you leave and not bring into your new civilization design? So I'll just stop talking now and leave the space for you. And once you're ready, you just start talking.
Okay, I'll start talking. I mean, yeah, this is like a really, really big question, which you can answer from so many different angles and perspectives. So I think I'll probably go into a little bit of a uncoordinated, I don't know, brainstorm response, something, and then maybe,
Something will evolve.
Yeah, you bring me back and you follow up and with certain questions. And yeah, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that we as a species have now been living in that kind of society for a couple of thousand years with its dynamics. I mean, we can narrow it down to, for example, the hierarchies or the competition and things, depending on whatever whoever you listen to or followers, might be 6,000 years, 10,000 years, but it's been a while, so it's quite deeply ingrained in us. And I mean, that kind of society model has, in a way allowed us to thrive. I mean, there's debate about how well we've been thriving or not, but yeah, I mean, the human species is still there. We managed to become the masters of the world in a way. I mean, we've become very good in exterminating pretty much everything else around us. So we could say we've been successful in a way so far, but and especially looking at the last 40 years, we have taken such a quantum leap in our evolution. So we are so used to that kind of lifestyle, to that kind of society. And if you now go into that scenario where you arrive in this completely pristine new space and you want to start something completely new, it will be very hard to really start something completely new because we are so conditioned from the old system that we will be anyway in a lot of ways repeating the same mechanisms and dynamics again and again until they grow out of our system over the next, I don't know, 2 or 3 generations probably. So just that as an introduction, I think, to phrase it a bit, because I think often we are a bit too optimistic that we can just create something completely new just out of the blue, because we can't. I mean, we have a lot of knowledge about how things could be, what we want to do differently, but we always have to be aware that we'll always be recreating the old system in different aspects and different facets. And so I think what will be very important when you're starting something new is just to acknowledge that fact, to acknowledge the fact that it's very important that as a group of people, you are really clear what you're talking about, what you're coming from, because if you don't really understand where you're coming from, you cannot really understand why you are that way and what you could create new out of that. So I think you need to have a very good collective understanding of why we ended up in that place, all the different dynamics and, you know, socioeconomic and all these systems, all the human systems and technological systems which we created us, which have been driving us there. So I think that's a very important step, to have this common understanding and to have a common language of that. Because very often we speak of things which we think everybody knows exactly what it is, but then after a while you find out that we have very different understandings of what that term actually means. So if you really want to start anew, I think it is very important to take a lot of time to prepare yourself, to have, you know, a lot of very well facilitated group processes, I think. Because, you know, I assume if we're like, I don't know, 500 people somewhere in the jungle or where else, I mean, we can take that time. We don't have emails or appointments and stuff, so we can really sit down and talk the shit out and to really really take that time. And I think that would be a first step to really also come together as a group and really understand what you actually want to do. So you also have to be very clear about your vision, and I think that will take you another I don't know, few afternoons of discussion. And also being aware, I think, that what's the kind of common denominator, what you want to create, but that not everything can be appealing to everybody. I mean, you need, if you have a group which is very homogeneous, everybody wants the same thing, it will not work, because, I mean, communities always have to be mixed, or very as a word,
heterogeneically.
Heterogenic, yeah, exactly, yeah. Because we need diversity. You really need diversity in a group, but you also need the, let's say, emotional maturity to, you know, being to able to accept diversity and to appreciate diversity and to invite diversity and to be grateful for diversity, and not, you know, as we're seeing it in these days, go into these crazy polarizations and, you know, just like, I mean, we have to value ourselves as humans and our differences we have, and our different needs, and yeah, and in order to able to get there, I think you also need quite a lot of emotional maturity, and you need quite a bit of, you know, maybe personal development work, or, I mean, you could say it needs a certain level of consciousness, but I don't even want to go into that discussion, because I think these are in kind of human characteristics which are quite inherent. I think if we are like really in a space where we can really be who we are, and we don't have to wear these masks and don't have this kind of social conditioning, I think we can avoid a lot of these pitfalls that you know, of segregation and from judging each other, and but it will always need a very conscious commitment, a dedication to personal work, to really, you know, work on building that, what you want to create as a new society, or as a new settlement, or whatever it is. It doesn't just come with building fancy infrastructure, you know, like to have all these cool tiny houses and whatever, all the things like we said before, we always see in these fancy pitch decks of all these new settlements. I think very often we forget that, let's say, the invisible structures, you can call it the governance or the, you know, decision makings, and all these things are so much more important whether you live in a, you know, like in a 3D printed tiny house, or in a not 3D printed tiny house. So
I want to go in here, because that's ties some things together. You said you discovered a talent in yourself for creating spaces. And how do these spaces, which you are now saying aren't that as important as the invisible infrastructure, which is a beautiful term. So what's the importance in the combination of the physical and the invisible, or the visible and the invisible infrastructure?
I think it's, I mean, you can say if you're building a new place or new society, you have to build physical infrastructure and invisible infrastructure. But these two processes are very interwoven in a way, because one will dictate the other. Because if you have space design, or if you're looking at, placemaking, or you can call it ontological design, where the idea is that when you create something physical, it has influence on you and vice versa. So I think the spaces really have to be purpose built, with, you can call it, like a energetical setup that, things have to be built in a certain way to enable certain things to happen within them. I'm a strong believer in that when you build physical infrastructure with a certain outcome in mind, it can really benefit the outcome of that. But both tracks are equally important, and they have to be in constant exchange with each other. You cannot just have a group which is like really passionate about building stuff, and another group which is more passionate about running the stuff. This has to be in a constant exchange and and teamwork, I think. But at the same time, it also wouldn't be very, let's say, effective or efficient if everything is always being done together. But yeah, of course, it makes sense that people who are good at certain things focus on that, but it still needs the communication between the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would say, yeah.
And in creating this space, so how to me it seems that this would be hard to deliberate on and organize among a group of 500 people, if we stick with that number. How would you organize this balance between the ontological and the more epistemic, invisible? How would you create the? I guess I've never thought about it, so I'm also improvising here. But I guess that you could say it starts with a seed, in a way, of the core design pattern for both the ontological and the epistemic, in the form of a first community building that serves as a place for the sense making. I don't know, I'm just riffing. But how would you go about this?
Well, I mean, there's obviously the question, how would this settlement start, I mean, are you being dropped out of a spaceship into that place without any preparation, or do you
Let's say yes. Let's say yes.
Oh,
Let's
shit.
say yes.
Okay. I mean, obviously, the question is, well, I mean, do you have the necessary skills in that group? Do you have resources into that group? I mean, have you chosen that place where you want to be? I mean, is that an ideal space? I mean, because obviously wherever you end up, I mean, let's say if we dropped, by that spaceship in Antarctica, I mean, we have other issues than we're being dropped in Costa Rica.
Okay, so where do you want to be dropped, and what are the core skills you would want?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you're being dropped somewhere where you don't have to deal with very harsh climatical conditions as of the beginning. and where you have, let's say, fertile soil or ground. So I think from the two examples I said, I think it's going to be rather Costa Rica than Antarctica, because this just makes things so much easier. I mean, if you're not have to fight for your survival from the beginning. So, and for the skills, I mean, ideally you have a lot of people in that group which have been thinking about stuff like that beforehand, which have community experience. And you then will obviously need, let's say, one part of the people which is very physically skilled. I mean, people who can really build shit. I mean, who can take care of agriculture, who can build houses, who can deal with, like, I don't know, electricity, with septic tanks, with just the basics. And then you have another group which is then a bit more skilled, maybe with the whole logistics, organization, group process design, facilitation, governance, and stuff like that. I mean, there's two very different skill sets, but they're very important and complementary. Because, like you said, I mean, you have to start somewhere. So let's say, well, ideally you come to a place where there's already some basic infrastructure. Let's say there's I don't know, whatever, an old retreat center or like a hotel or something that you can take over and start having basic functionality already there. So it just makes it easier than whereas you have to come there and start chopping down trees to create a first assembly hall. So ideally there will be something there already. But of course, not everybody, again, will want to sit through all those hours and hours of meetings, like we said in the beginning. I mean, it's a proven fact that in communities, not everybody is interested in the governance procedures, and that's fine. Not everybody has to, but you still have to go through like a common initial process where you set the foundation of, like the basic values, the principles on how you're operating on a very broad term, but this has to be understood and kind of agreed and signed by everybody. I think you really have to start on that common ground, and then you can start separating into more work-driven groups of, like the people who do the infrastructure. I mean, if you have a builder, he doesn't want to sit in the office the whole day and design governance procedures. He just doesn't like that, and he doesn't have to do it. So you have to have those two skills. And I mean, personally, even though, I mean, I'm aware of a lot of these group facilitation tools and holacracy and sociocracy and things like that, but what would really be the best tool in the end to do such a process? I mean, I wouldn't be able to answer it right now. I mean, there might be various tools, and you might have to adapt the tool to the specific group you have. But it will definitely help if you have people who are experienced in large group facilitation.
To that example with the hotel that you just brought. So, and what you said earlier about the bi-directional influence of the visible onto the invisible, and vice versa. So dropping into that hotel with the 500 people will, with the various interests, might have the consequence that some people are going to sit in the penthouse and do some high-level abstract thinking, and while others are somewhere in the kitchen cooking, and yet others are lounging, and somebody else is sitting in the director's office. So to me, that seems that just choosing the building to be like, this is a confirmation or affirmation of what you said earlier, that choosing that type of building will reaffirm the structures that we have. So in that sense, dropping into a hotel might be a really bad choice. If you could design the dream space for you, for those 500 people, and let's say don't think about the design constraints. You're dropping in to the dream space for starting that community. What would that physical space look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, just to finish up with the hotel, I mean, it could be a starting point where out of that you keep on growing, and whatever you grow out of that, I mean, I think it will, like we spoke of this emotional maturity before, that we ideally would also be able to let go of all these needs for status and how we associate, well, okay, this guy has a bigger space than me, I'm jealous. But we also have to see that there are people who have different needs. So if this guy really tells me, well, I need 2 bedrooms because otherwise I just really don't have quality of life, and there's other people, they can live with a family of 5 in a tiny house and they're fine. I mean, we also have to be able to accept differences like that. And then maybe that person who insists on having the 2 bedrooms is also just going through a process because he just can't let go of that need just right yet. But maybe within 2 or 3 years, he might also be cool to live in a tiny house. So I think we still have to give the people a little bit of choice in the levels of comfort they want. There might be somebody who's fine just going into a tent. So that's why I think it's hard. Ideally, everybody should have very similar types of infrastructures units. And let's say if we start in this new paradigm, I mean, it would be hard for us to go back to live in tree houses, with like leaves and branches. So I trust that also with the technological progress, whatever 3D printing or not, that we would all have some pretty cool tiny houses, which maybe give us a bit less space that we have nowadays, but with more like less private space, but then more communal areas, so that we all have a pretty cool private area, which is pretty similar than everybody else has. But then we splurge more on the common areas, that there you have all the cool things. Like I spoken recently to somebody who's building, I think, a new community in, I don't know, Canada or somewhere. And they said, if we look at the plot and we identify certain spots which are much nicer than the others, which have more sun, which are just, like more central, these are the spots for everybody. So the nicest places are always for everybody. And then the individual spaces, they can be in the maybe not so nice areas. So, but in the end, I think you always have to give a bit room for trade-offs, and that people are changing their needs, and it should be okay to change their needs. And if somebody really believes again after 5 years, well, this tiny house really sucks, I want 2 tiny houses, then maybe we should be able to accommodate that, or maybe not. But I think it should have that freedom for each individual to really find his own comfort zone or his level of comfort, where he feels he can thrive, but also the community can thrive. So I don't know if that answered the.
Let me translate that into my words to see whether I understood, and I'm also going to match in the Canadian example because I really like that. So you would say, let's have a one or more spaces for community, which preferably is in spots where people like to hang out, and have a variety of living spaces that fit the needs of the people around that, but that also, while they're presenting the necessities, they're not overly luxurious. I can, in what you said, I could feel a tendency towards incentivizing people to go to the communal spaces. That's how I see the setup at the moment. And this could be the variety of living spaces, could be 3D printed tiny houses all the way to tents, depending on what people's preferences are. So if that is right, so let's I would be super interested in what would you see. Does that reflect in the invisible? So what would happen with that in the visible space? What would happen in the invisible space, and how would you start to curate the invisible space that fits that visible space?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, now just thinking about it, obviously, you can also not expect everybody to be wanting to be always in these communal spaces. I mean, out of a sample of 500 people, there might be some who just, they just want to have their little garden with a little fence around, and that's fine too. I mean, we have to be able to live with that. But obviously, the more you have, like like you said, public spaces, there needs a bit of curation, because also there you see in different personality profiles, certain people have different needs in terms of cleanliness, order, being orderly, space design, and so it will also need certain rules and regulations. I mean, this always sounds a bit absurd if you're talking about maybe new paradigms. Some people always feel like, oh, why do we still need to have rules and regulations again? But I think every society, and even self-organization also needs rules and regulations, but you can design them yourself, and they can they can be evolutionary, they can change, and they can be adapted. But yeah, once you have communal space has to be managed, it has to be maintained, it has to be curated, and that will need certain people who take care of that. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. Otherwise, a communal space will look like a mess after a couple of weeks, most probably. And I mean, I've been living in many communities. I mean, just last year, I lived in a house with 17 people. And it's not that some people are messy. I mean, you could say they're maybe messy, but they just have different levels of understanding of what cleanliness means. And there's always people that end up cleaning more than others. And it always comes down in communities. There's always like a few things like cleanliness or food or pets or noise. It always comes down to 5 things which usually trigger conflict. And yeah, this has to be addressed, and it's a continuous process on these internal structures and how you maintain them, that everybody thinks, wow, this is like a really cool place to live in. I mean, it will require work and effort, and I think maybe that's why we've gone so much into isolation in our current society, because we just shy away from the exchange with other people, because we just rather have everything in our perfect little space, so we don't have to deal with anybody, and we can just focus on our stuff and not deal with anybody else, because we just don't have the headspace, we don't have the energy. And it takes energy to live in community. It's not to be underestimated. It's transformative. Yeah.
So just that, what you just highlighted, the fact that there is communal space, and that communal space need to be maintained, creates a need for some invisible fabric that emerges. And it might emerge naturally, just by some people taking more care. But that then usually gives rise to some conflict. And as soon as you have conflict, you need to have some form of conflict regulation. And this is probably at the core of the difficulty of building such a community. How do you optimize towards good conflict resolution, minimize conflicts in the first place, but optimize towards good conflict resolution to the benefit of everyone? And so, based on experience, what could that look like?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a big topic, and I think that also what differentiates successful and less successful communities, because if you constantly have these conflicts and these frictions to deal with, it takes so much of your time and energy. And yeah, I mean, you could say that, I mean, this whole, let's say, community living thing, that's again, you know, a rather new kind of trend, which maybe now since 60s or 70s is again becoming more popular. And even nowadays, when you go and visit certain communities or eco-villages or whatever, you can very quickly see in a way how they handle their internal stuff, in from the way how, you know, I just have to move here because there's moving people coming, delivering a 40-foot container. Are they coming? Oh, okay. Then I'm just gonna go away and move this. Oh, 2 Minuten, Thomas.
Don't worry, alles gut.
I'm surprised they're really on time, eh?
It shouldn't be too hard to move. This three of us. Oh, you're still in your call.
Yeah. I'll have another. Yeah, because one of the guys living here is just shipping his 40-foot container from San Francisco to here.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so yeah, the conflict resolution community. I think it also has to do a lot with the individual maturity of people who live there, because what I've seen a lot in community is that people just thrive on conflict and on endless discussions, and it really depends. Do you want that or you don't want that? And I think it also has to do with how much of your personal emotional baggage you still have with you, and is still unresolved, or yeah, how well you actually handle these processes. I mean, the clearer structures I believe you have in place, how even to, you know, prevent these kind of conflicts from arising, the clearer you have things defined before, the less risk of conflict you have. And you need well-trained, you know, conflict resolution people who are assigned for that. Because yeah, I mean, in our current society, there's a lot of suppressed conflict. I mean, we often, I don't know, in German is this expression, die Faust in Sack machen, glaube ich. Maybe that's a Swiss expression, I don't know.
Yeah, something like
Because,
this.
yeah, we constantly deal with a lot of aggression and frustrations, but that we cannot vent, and we just live with it because that's just the way it is. You know, you can't always be right, or you know, it's just the way, you know. The small man is always being suppressed, and you have to accept all these things. But then once you get into the setting of a community, you don't want to deal with this anymore. So I think in a community setting where you're basically somehow want to create this, you know, ideal space, you can express yourself, much more conflict comes up. And I think much more small things trigger conflict that they would, let's say, in the normal world outside. So I think you also have to be aware of that, and just because often in traditional communities a lot of people are doing personal transformation or like emotional work, every, you know, like small thing creates a huge drama. So I think it also probably helps that as a community you are not just kind of like a self-help community, but you're like an actual, you know, living system, and you also have to, you know, take your survival, you have to, you know, create income or somehow feed yourself. So I think that also distracts a lot from this you know, often I would maybe call it, you know, a luxury we have in our, you know, like Western world, that we can have these traditional maybe community settings where we often, I don't know, sometimes just have too much time and less other stuff to take care of, so that we can spend so much time on endless discussions and conflicts. But I don't know if that really answered your question.
Let's go. There are a couple of threads here. So there's one strong thread about distribution of responsibilities. Responsibility of food sourcing, for example. Responsibility also of conflict resolution and maybe even judging, but also responsibility of setting some rules. So it seems like we cannot get out of the having to set some rules. And then what I'm also hearing on an individual level, the responsibility for personal development. So there seems to be a somewhat yet undiscussed understanding of the level of personal development. So from a chat earlier, I would say maybe you would only allow people over the age of 40 into the community, because they've already learned enough about life. But unfortunately, that won't be the reality. You will have some wild 16 to 26-year-olds who will rip apart all of your rules, and so this is something that this community will have to deal with. So what would your take be on that? So how would you deal with that?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think it's also hard to answer it like in theory, but I mean, there's this nice African saying that, you know, a community or a village is only as strong as its weakest member. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you always have, let's say, conflict potential or troublemakers in each society, but then that again, you know, also adds to the diversity a bit, and not everything has to be perfect and following the rules, but it always has, you know, probably certain limits to what is really destabilizing a community, and what the community can actually hold. But then again, you know, if suddenly there is, let's say, a big tendency within the community which does not agree anymore with the direction that the space is going, I mean, yeah, these are things which then have to be in a way either worked out within the community, or ideally you have certain, let's say, functions or gremiums, or like, you know, like circles or groups in place which then have that authority, which everybody I mean, there is given authority to solve these problems, because I mean, that's what happens in our society. I mean, then authority has the court, and once the court has spoken, we all accept it, because that's just, we have to accept it, because if you keep on questioning the highest authorities, well, we just cannot operate like that as a society. At some point, we just have to trust that something decides in the best intention for us, because
okay.
And yeah, I mean, these things have to be put into place, but it will be a constant experimentation with it. But at some point, you have to decide on a system that you will accept that system, and we will go for it for a while just to try it. Otherwise, it will not work. Yeah.
Okay, that was something interesting. You said, so from the way you're describing your community, it seems that you trust a lot in positive emergence, I would call it, on the community level, but also on an individual level, despite all of the, or even because all of the potential for conflict, and you're accepting those potentials, and potential conflicts as a part of it. But that now led to something very interesting that you said in half a sentence, and I want to maybe put a little light on that, which was you let something emerge, decide that you're going to live it for a while, which means that after a while, you have to be also prepared to break it down again and decide together that you want to go into a new experiment. Have you seen that function? Because it rings super true, but I think it's also super hard to get a community to consciously reevaluate their own functioning.
Mm. Yeah, I totally see what you mean, and I mean, ideally, I would hope that in a new community or like in a new space like that, everybody has a very clear understanding of the continuation, this continuous process of reinventing and re-evaluating things. It doesn't have to be, you know, within a month or every second year. It can be longer cycles, but we need to have a very clear understanding that things are just not set in stone, and that, you know, as we are evolving as human species or like individuals, also our structures and our governance and our infrastructure will evolve with us. And this is something which we are not used to in our current society. I mean, we're still operating with all these, you know, old established frameworks from like 200-300 years ago. So I would hope that a community like that has this deep ingrained understanding of change, to embrace change as a very normal thing. But I mean, as practical examples, I mean, what you often see is in communities which have had a very charismatic founder, often a spiritual founder, but what happens when this person disappears, when this person dies? Because before that this person was always calling the shots, basically, to take decisions, and then he's gone, and then people have to reinvent themselves, reorganize themselves. I mean, you can, I don't know, for example, in Damanhur, I mean, when their founder died, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I mean, I had some discussions with people from there, and they said, well, we had to completely to reinvent ourselves because there was this huge vacuum. He was gone, and suddenly we had to figure it out ourselves. So I think this always happens. I mean, now it's, whether it's a founder or where it's, you know, can be things that happen from the outside, from the inside. It could be anything, but I think it's normal that we have to reinvent ourselves.
Do you think there's a possibility of building that into the ontological design of your community? So I'm thinking of a very concrete example in Julia Watson's book, Low Tech. She talks about the several communities around the globe that are building floating dwellings. And they're building them with natural materials, and they accept that they last about a generation. So you build your dwelling for 25 years and then it's gone, then you have to build a new one. And this cyclic nature that this introduces in your life, you will be living in 3 to 4 houses in your life. You know it, there's no way around it, because they just will be gone. Do you think something like that would be possible? And if so, how would you counteract our apparent need for stability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think these are like beautiful examples, and I've also seen like what on the Lake Titicaca, these indigenous people living on these floating islands, and yeah, I mean, they only last for a certain amount of time, and they already know in 5 years they're going to break down, so we start building the new ones. And in a way, it's beautiful because you're like really in this surrendering to the cycles of life, and you're not attached anymore to things lasting forever. And I think that's that's something to strive for. I think this will be. It also has to do with us accepting, our own death, that we are finite ourselves, and it will be a beautiful evolution if we can, accept this again more in our society, and start living according to it, and not having this desire to build monuments forever and to be remembered forever, and just to be more humble. I think that would be beautiful. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could that also be a part, so mirroring that into the invisible, could that also be part of the invisible structures, in the sense that I know of some people who are you still there? Martin, you're frozen. Hello. Hi.
Hey, you're back.
Yes.
I don't know, I was gone, or
I think from my end you were gone.
okay.
But,
and you from
somewhere along the line the internet was gone. Doesn't matter.
Okay, good. Good.
So my question was, if you build into your ontological design that there is no escaping an iteration, meaning all of your physical components of your community are bound to decay in, let's say, at least a generation.
Mm.
Could that also be mirrored in the invisible structures? In a way, like I know of somebody who's just starting a company, and that company's life is limited to 5 years by definition and right from the get-go. So, are you still there? Something seems to be dropping. Can you hear me? Hi.
Okay,
I was
that's
just
a
testing
bit.
my connection here. I was getting in double to see whether
That's a bit
the
annoying.
problem is on my end.
Yeah.
Okay.
So to answer that question, I mean that's obviously that with this company with the 5 years, I mean that's kind of like a interesting experiment. I think they're doing, but I mean in the end, the governance and the whole invisible infrastructure has to reflect that commitment to this evolutionary purpose or this evolutionary nature of your existence or of the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure you're creating. I think it makes absolute sense, and basically you just have to kind of let go a bit of that attachment. Things will last forever, and you're in this kind of it's this kind of attitude of continual prototyping or experiencing, experimenting, and I mean certain periods. Then maybe you come up with something really cool, and everybody is like really into it, and you might even live an entire generation without changing a thing. And then maybe the next generation is gonna change everything completely. But there's nothing wrong with that. I think the change is only so difficult nowadays because we live in this extremely interconnected, like hyper-capitalist and globalized environment where you just cannot substantially or fundamentally change certain things because it's just too complicated. I mean, of course you can, but if you really want, and if you all agree that we want, but it's just so hard. And if you have like this very lean structure in a way, I mean, you could literally change within days and weeks. You can do so many things, and I think it's an exciting thought. Not everybody is probably gonna like that either, but you will be able to find maybe a good middle way for it. Yeah.
How do you prevent in such a setup that people start sticking to the subjective stability of the system? I think I lost you again.
Okay, it's getting a bit challenging now.
Yeah.
Is it by you, or is it with you or with me? Because I just heard other people in our house are also having connectivity issues.
So I believe that it's on your side, because I also tested with my phone, and it seems all to be working.
Okay.
Should we switch off the cameras to save some bandwidth and just stay on voice then?
Yeah, let's try for now. Yeah. It might have to do with the stuff they're moving here, or I don't know, because I just saw in our group chat that other people are also having internet issues. So
yeah, yeah, no worries. We just pick up where we were.
Good.
The question was about how to ensure or help people not to get too stuck on the stability of the system they're creating. What could be techniques to support a group of people with that?
Well, I think it. I mean, just generally. I mean, we spoke before about like the whole transition from one society to a new society, but it's just the whole worldviews that come with that and the belief systems. And I mean, if you look back, I mean, just the life our great parents or great parents had was so different from what we had now. So I think this kind of sense of stability and that things are lasting forever is still rather new in a way. I think it wouldn't be too hard for people to go back to that if you just put things a bit into perspective. I mean, we all can relate to the life our parents or great parents had. I mean, they came out of all this whole war situation, etc., and the famines and poverty, and I think we would see it as natural pretty quickly again if we just see it from the historical context. And I mean, yeah, we just have to let go a bit of this attachment and believe that we can control things. It also has to do a lot with control, that we are in control of our lives. We can kind of eliminate all the unpleasant surprises, all the variables, all the unknowns out of our lives. That's just an illusion, but I think that's a very recent illusion in a way.
I mean, maybe from your personal experience, you went through a phase of letting go of these things. What would you recommend, or what in your community to people to do in order to help them with this process of letting go of controls, letting go of ownership or stability, longevity?